Hey guys, my name is Jim, one of the pastors here at the Paradox Church. We're here in Fort Worth, Texas. Glad that you could join us wherever you are. We're going to be in the Gospel of Luke. We're taking about 2 years to walk through Luke, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, because Luke, he's a doctor. He said at the beginning of his book, he said that he's writing this carefully ordered eyewitness account that we might have certainty about what we believe. And so in a world of uncertainty, we want to grab a hold of something. And Luke, he offers us Jesus. And so we're just walking together, investigating together, searching together to see if Jesus is something that we should grab a hold of. And we're going to talk about how to be strong in the midst of our fear and hurt. How do you respond with those that disagree with you? How do you respond to those that hurt you? How do you respond to those that oppose you? In our text today, Jesus says maybe his most famous thing, to love your enemies. And it's one of those sayings from Jesus that sounds so lofty, like just so high, that virtually nobody disagrees with it. Nobody's going to argue with this particular kind of teaching. And yet we're not exactly sure what to do with it either. It doesn't quite feel right to love our enemies, right? Like what does he mean by that? And how are we supposed to do that? And does it mean that I should be a doormat for people? Is that what that means to love my enemies? The famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he said that Christianity was weak, that Christians were weak, in part because of sayings like this, to love your enemies. Is that true? Are Christians weak? Is this a weak response to those that would perhaps harm us? It's interesting. A lot of philosophies and religions, they share a lot of ethics with biblical Christianity, but not one of them, not Islam, not Buddhism, not humanism for sure, teach us to love our enemies. And so what do we make of this? And then you just add to it that this has been one of the most misinterpreted teachings of Jesus as well. And so we're gonna have to do a little work to understand what is he actually saying. But when we do the work, I think we're gonna find this teaching to be the answer for how we can be strong in the midst of our hurt or our fear. In fact, I wonder if maybe we've been going at it the wrong way. Like if our strategy, our response to, especially in our context now, like our response to the opposition, to the other team, whatever that is for you, has been wrong. Like maybe our strategy, maybe we've been kicking ourselves. Maybe we've been going at this thing the whole wrong way. And maybe Jesus offers a better, more healing, a stronger way in which we can respond to our own hurt and fear. Now, there's one thing that we're going to have to remember, and that's that this teaching is coming in a particular context. It's coming in the context of Jesus's famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, where the first 5 chapters of Luke is highlighting pretty much one thing about us. He's saying that it's the broken, the needy, the sinner, the poor that come to Jesus. That Jesus didn't come for those who don't think they need him, but for those that do realize that they need Jesus. And then he starts the Sermon on the Mount in our text last week. He started it and he said, hey, this new people, this new humanity, this new church, these followers of mine, that's what they're like. They are the poor in spirit. They are the needy. They are the broken, and they are the blessed ones. They're the ones that are happy. They're the happy ones. But then he said, right before this text that we're going to look at today, but woe to you if you don't think you need me. Woe to you if you're rich. Woe to you if you're the put together. Woe to you if you don't think that you need me. And so we don't have time to explain it today, but biblically, the poor were the oppressed. They weren't just materially poor. They were the disenfranchised. They weren't empowered. They weren't safe. They were the exploited ones. And it was the rich that most often, of course, were the ones doing the oppressing, which is why God in the Old Testament often is warning the rich to not exploit the poor, to not oppress the poor. And so here's my point so that we can understand this passage and rightly understand what's happening here when he says to love our enemies. He has been warning us, our author Luke has been warning us up to this point that we shouldn't be the spiritual middle class. Like, I don't know what your church history has been like, where you're at in your spiritual journey or what, but the spiritual middle class, that place that doesn't really need Jesus, that doesn't really need grace, that doesn't really need mercy. Luke has been warning us to not fall into that we should confess our brokenness, confess our sin, confess our neediness. But here's the thing. If we do, what happens if we are opposed? If we're the weak, if we're the needy, if we're the broken, what happens when we're hurt? What happens when we have enemies? Do we fight back? Do we let them walk over us? What do we do? And so Jesus says in verse 26, hey, woe to you who don't need me. Woe to you who are the oppressors. Woe to you who are the spiritual middle class. But then he gets to our text in verse 27 and he says, but I say to you who hear, love your enemies. And so he's speaking to the poor in spirit. He's speaking to the needy. He's speaking to the Christian. And he says, hey, I want you to love those guys. I want you to love your enemies. Now, two questions immediately come to my mind. First, what does he mean by love? What does that mean? And of course, what does he mean by enemy? Who's my enemy? So first, let's talk about maybe what's happening here with this word love, because the way that we talk about love in our culture isn't the same thing as biblical love. Right? We love our grandma and we love breakfast tacos. We fall in love and we fall out of love. The way in which we use love is more emotional. It's more a feeling. That's what we're speaking to. And primarily the Bible doesn't speak in that way about love. That's not what biblical love is. I don't know if you remember the great movie Dan in Real Life, but the punk kid boyfriend, he gets pretty close to what biblical love is when he looks at Steve Carell's character and he says, love is an ability. Right? Love is an ability. This kind of love that Jesus is talking about here is a love that moves. It's a love that stands strong. It's a love that acts. It's that kind of love. There are different words for love in the Greek language, which is what the Bible, the New Testament, was written in. And the word that Jesus uses here is the word agape. It's a similar word to the Hebrew word in the Old Testament that's used for love called hesed, which is translated steadfast love. That's what agape love is. It's steadfast. It stands strong. It moves to act. It's an ability. It's an action. That's what he means by love. Jesus isn't saying you should have eros love for your enemy, erotic love for your enemy. That's weird. And there's a name for people that have eros love for somebody that hurts them. That's not what he's talking about. So love here, it doesn't mean you have to agree. Love here doesn't mean you have to like the person. It doesn't mean you have to like your enemy. Love here doesn't mean that you have to trust them. Love here doesn't mean that you're a doormat for them. In fact, agape love isn't a doormat love at all. It's not a weak love at all. It's the strongest kind of love. This is a strong love that he's talking about, okay? So to love your enemies, it means to do exactly what he says in the following verses. In verse 27, here's what it means to love, agape love. Do good, right? It's active. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. To one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. As you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. The famous golden rule. So this idea of doing good, that's what he means by agape love, to do good. It's active. And this idea of doing good to your enemies is all throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, in Proverbs 25, it talks about it. In the New Testament, Romans 12 talks about it. A couple of years ago, we walked through the first letter of Peter, where he's writing to Christians, a church in which they are largely opposed in the culture, right? So much like the post-Christian culture that we're in now, where it's not very popular to be a Christian, it's becoming less and less popular to be public and passionate about your faith. He instructs Christians in that kind of context to do good, right? To those that would oppose you, to those that would hurt you, to those that would malign you, do good. That's agape love. Okay, that's the kind of love that seeks to do good to our enemy. That's a strong love, right? That's a strong love. Now, who's our enemy? Who's our enemy that we're supposed to love in this kind of way? Well, in another version of this sermon, in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew records Jesus as saying something a little bit more. Jesus says there, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor, but hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemy as well." And what's happening is that in that context, in that culture, very similar to ours, is that you had some teachers that were interpreting this Old Testament teaching to love your neighbor. They were interpreting that teaching to love our neighbor as an excuse to hate our enemy. Okay, so love your neighbor, love the one that's with you, love your friend, love your tribe, love your team, but you can hate, you can oppose your enemy. And just like Jesus says in verse 40 later in this text, a disciple will always become like his teacher. The Jewish culture had been taught that, and so it had become okay, it had become a part of the culture to hate the Romans because the Romans were oppressing the Jewish people at this time. It's the same thing in our day, where our culture, we've been taught that when we disagree, we should rant and rave and call each other names and engage in identity politics and tribalism, and we cancel each other, we fight back, right? Bless those who curse you. No, I'm going to curse you back. Pray for those who abuse you. No, I'm going to refuse to forgive you. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. No, I'm going to demand my rights, clearly state to you how you better treat me. Love your enemies. No way. I'm going to hate the person that disagrees with me. I'm going to shame them. I'm going to gossip against them. I'm going to get angry at them. That is the way in which, that's the culture that we breathe in our day as well. And so our enemy then is anyone who would cause that in us, who would stir that in us, anyone that would disagree with us, anyone that would oppose us, anyone that would hurt us, anyone that would cause us to fear, anyone who is the other. Right? They're different. They're on the other team. They aren't one of us. We don't think they're our neighbor. They're not our friend. They're not on our team. That's our enemy. And so what Jesus is saying is, no. Your enemy is your neighbor too. Your enemy is your neighbor. Right? That was the whole point of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that your enemy, the guy on the other team, the guy that opposes you, the guy that you think he is your neighbor too. And so you can see why this is so hard. I want you to have an active, agape, moving towards somebody love for the person that opposes you, hurts you, betrays you, disagrees with you, is on the other team as you. And yet to love your enemy is revolutionary. It's revolutionary. It's upside down, and it's scary. And it takes a strong love to do it, but if we do, it changes the world. I was trying to meditate on this week. Like, what do I do when I'm hurt or opposed or people disagree with me? Do I love my enemies? Do I even want to? And to be honest, like, I don't. I mean, this isn't natural at all, man. I'm a pastor, I'm a Christian, and it's not natural at all. And I think there's a reason why it's hard for me. I think there's a reason why our culture is so divided and polarized right now. And it's a part of our culture, like it was in the Jewish culture at that time, to hate our enemies. Where it's so easy, it's even popular to spew vitriol right now instead of to pour out agape type love. And I think it's because we're afraid, right? We're fearful. We're the most fearful, stressed out, anxious culture in the history of the world. By the way, I think that has a lot to do with our wealth. We have a lot to lose, and so we have a lot to be afraid of. Right? But we're easily afraid, we're easily hurt, we're easily offended. That is just our culture. That is just the way that things are. It's interesting. There's a great book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And the authors, they look at these three false ideas that permeate our culture, our Western culture now, especially on college campuses, especially with younger generations. They look at these, they talk about these three false ideas. One is the false idea of fragility, where we this idea that we can't handle hard things, so we should avoid them, right? We can't deal with people that would disagree with us, so we shouldn't be a part of those conversations. Things that maybe would offend us, things that might hurt us. There's a fragility to us. They talk about this false idea of what they call emotional reasoning, that we should always trust our feelings, right? That our feelings trump truth, that love is always a feeling, for example. And then they also talk about this false idea of that kind of us versus them mentality that is our culture right now, where the life is a battle between good people and bad people. And of course, we think we're the good people. But it's not just the three false ideas that they put forward that they're saying we're believing right now. It's the 6 trends that they identify as to what created that. All right, so listen to these 6 trends. There's a theme in them that I think speaks to why it's so hard for us to love our enemies. They say the first trend is rising political polarization, which has led to rising hate crimes and harassment on campuses. Second, rising levels of teen anxiety and depression, which have made many students more desirous of protection. Changes in parenting practices, which have amplified children's fears, even as childhood becomes increasingly safe. Like I was thinking about this today. My cousin posted something on Facebook. Like, we didn't even have car seats when I was a kid. Like, we were just running around playing games in the car. Like, childhood was much less safe 30 years ago than it is now. 4, the loss of free play and unsupervised risk-taking, both of which kids need to become self-governing adults. 5, the growth of campus bureaucracy and an expansion of its protective mission, right? So administrative stuff on campus. And then 6, a rising passion for justice, which is good, but it's combined with changing ideas about what justice requires. Okay. And so the theme for all of this, if I look at these 6 trends, the theme for all of these things is fear. Fear. And listen, fear is paralyzing. Fear is paralyzing. And when you're afraid, you pretty much can't do anything else. But Jesus is saying, love those you fear. Love those that you fear. One of my favorite verses is 1 John 4:18. It says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Isn't that great? There was an Atlantic article that actually sought to prove that verse scientifically. It was written during the pandemic, and they talked about, that love does eliminate fear, and they wanted to talk about it scientifically, where fear, it's a primary emotion that's processed in the amygdala in our brain, right? Part of our brain. Well, and it's the place in our brain that detects threat, right? It signals you when you should fight or flight, right? It's that part of the brain that does that. And so it produces these stress hormones that make us figure out, like, what are we going to do? We're going to fight? We're going to run? What are we going to do? And it happens involuntarily, of course, but in our context now, we operate in this mode a lot. Like we operate in that fear, that fight or flight mode at work, right? It's not just when we're facing real life-threatening things, like a tiger is going to eat us, right? Our ancestors had to deal with real threats. We just have to deal with emails, right? The ding of the email all of a sudden just creates that stress response in us. And so we tighten up and our heart beats faster and fear gets signaled, right? Those fear response, it signals us and we get a dose of adrenaline and cortisol and we're on high alert and it's just because somebody made a bad comment on Facebook. It's happening all the time. But then God, he gave us another hormone response that actually calms that fear response called oxytocin, sometimes called the love hormone. And so oxytocin is produced in the brain, and it's typically in response to eye contact and touch and things like that, especially between loved ones. And it's a really powerful chemical. It's extremely pleasurable, and life would be terrible without it. In fact, there's evidence that oxytocin or an oxytocin deficit is one of the reasons why depression was on the rise during the pandemic. We had social distancing, we had lockdowns. We just didn't have the physical contact that's needed to raise the oxytocin levels so we could be happier. But this is where it gets really powerful. The Atlantic article goes on to say this. Oxytocin reduces anxiety and stress by inhibiting the response of the amygdala to outside stimuli. If you have loving contact with others, the outside world will seem less scary and threatening to you. What St. John asserted is literally true. Perfect love drives out fear. Isn't that amazing? We're afraid, and so we won't love. We're afraid, and so we won't love our enemies. But it's that very love that would cast out fear. Another reason why, as I thought about it, just why I don't want to love my enemies is because I don't want them to get away with it. Like I want them to change. I want them to stop. I want to change their mind. I want to change their behavior. I want them to be different, right? I want them on my team. I don't want them to get away with it. I want to cozy up to that. I don't want to make them feel like it's okay for them to think how they think or do what they do. And of course, we all know that people change by getting angry at them or punching them in the throat, right? People change all the time when you do that. Well, of course not. But that's my reticence, is I don't want them to get away with it, right? Jesus says to turn the other cheek. I would rather punch them in theirs, right? That's typically our response. Now, what Jesus is saying there is not somebody strikes you in the cheek, turn the other one. He's not saying let them hit you again. Okay, I want to clarify something here. This isn't a verse to advocate for staying in an abusive relationship, and please don't let anyone teach you that. It doesn't mean that Jesus wants you to be a doormat, not at all. Slapping someone in that culture and in ours is a sign of disrespect. This is more communal, this is more relational than this is physical. This is when somebody disrespects you, shames you, hurts you. What do? Do you strike them back? Do you let them have the same cheek and let them do it over and over and over again? No, you turn the other cheek, which means you're willing to step into the conversation. You're willing to not walk away from the relationship. You don't cancel them. You don't write them off. You're seeking reconciliation. You're seeking understanding. You're trying to promote change through active agape love. And yes, there's a chance in which they might disrespect you again. And yet love says, that's worth it to me to try to promote change, right? To promote change. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And so listen, like I don't want to love them because I want them to change, but what if only love can bring about that change? Adam Grant, an organizational psychologist, he's done a lot of work around this. Actually, he talks about counterfactual thinking, which is just a fancy phrase for put yourself in their shoes. Where instead of yelling at each other, let me tell you why racism is wrong and you're, you don't get it, or let me tell you why it's stupid to not get the vaccine. Why don't you, how do you not see this? You must be some kind of idiot. Instead of that approach, which always works, of course, instead of that, you treat the other person like a human being made in the image of God, even if they're your enemy, even if they're on the opposing side. Like I have a friend who grew up in Columbine, and he's a hunter, and he still is for the right to bear arms and personal freedoms and all of that. But he's going to probably be able to sympathize with somebody on the other side, somebody more anti-gun, right? Somebody that maybe is responding to the past two shootings in a way that is, maybe an extreme in his views, but he's gonna be able to respond to them in a way more compassionate and loving way because he's experienced that. He's walked in those shoes. He's gonna be able to love them well. Right? Or if you find yourself disagreeing with someone on the other side, whatever side that is, on the race wars, right? On your views on race, what it would look like to pursue friendship there, right? To sit at the table with them there, to pursue relationship, to love someone on the other side, and to engage in those conversations instead of just lobbing truth bombs or spewing vitriol over the fence at each other. We have a man in our congregation He's an older guy, he's a white guy, he's a staunch conservative who meets weekly with the younger black dude in our church as well. And they have these conversations around race and other things so that he can learn about his experience and learn about the young black man's views on race and culture and all of that. That's agape love. Right? That's agape love. If you don't do good, right? If you don't lay yourself out, if you don't open your home, if you don't open your wallet, if you don't open your heart, if you don't do that and you just hang out with people that are like you, you just are with people that you respect, you're just with people that agree with you, you'll never be a part of the revolution. You'll never be a part of change. You see, I don't want to love my enemies because I don't want them to get away with it. I want them to change. I want them to stop. But they won't change and they won't stop without love. It is only love that can bring about true, actual change. And so Jesus, he gives 4 reasons then, 4 motivations, 4 ways that would motivate us towards that kind of posture towards the other, towards the enemy. All right, so 4 reasons why we should keep moving towards that and have that willingness of heart to love our enemies in that way. And that's what the rest of the text talks about. Here's the first one, verse 32. If you love those who love you, think about this. What benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, and they get back the same amount. What is he saying? He's saying, aren't you different, Christian? He's saying, maybe you're not a Christian. Don't you want to be different? The whole world has a value of love. But what sets apart the Christian, what sets apart the church, what should set apart my followers, he's saying, what makes us different is that you love the unlovable, right? You don't love just your tribe, just the lovable ones, but you love your enemies, the ones that are hard to love. That's true love. That's real love. That's revolutionary love. When we love expecting nothing in return, when we love the unlovable. So the first motivation that Jesus gives is, hey, be different. You want to be radical? You want to be revolutionary? You want to be different? Then you love your enemies. The second reason he gives us is to be rewarded. Verse 35, but love your enemies and do good, lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. Literally, your reward will be much, that means. And Jesus is saying what he'll say a lot coming up in Luke's gospel, that you invest now, because Luke is writing primarily to rich, educated, Greek-speaking people. And so he's going to talk a lot about money. And Jesus is going to say, hey, what you invest in now will bring about the rewards later. Now, there's going to be some rewards that we can have in this life. We're going to see some change. We're going to see some revolution, but most of the rewards that we can expect are in the next life. Right? We're reaping rewards in heaven. And then he says, thirdly, hey, be a son. Verse 35, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. All right, this is awesome. So he says, hey, be rewarded, be different. Now, be a son. This is huge. He's saying, if you're a Christian, you're a son, you're a daughter, you're a child of the Most High God. And this is what God does. God loves his enemies. Right? That's a theme all throughout the Bible. Right? Elsewhere, Jesus will say that God sends rain on both the wicked and the righteous. This is what theologians call common grace, where you could be the most ardent atheist, right? You could be a guy watching right now that just hates God, that is so angry that people would believe in a God. Or you could be somebody that shakes your fist at God, and yet you still get to see the beauty of his sunset. And you still get to taste vintage red wine and medium rare bone-in ribeye, and you still get to enjoy the pleasures of sex. And that's God's common grace, where God in his agape love doesn't take away those things from you, even though you're his enemy. And then, of course, you have Jesus loving his enemy, Judas, as an amazing example of this. I thought it was really funny last week when we covered the text where Jesus chooses the 12 apostles and how there were two guys named Judas. Can you imagine being the other Judas? Like the rest of his life, he's got to say, no, I'm not that one. Or I'm not that one. That was the other one. But Judas, like on Thursday, we're going to celebrate the Last Supper. We're going to celebrate the night of Jesus's betrayal, where Judas, Jesus says, one of you will betray me. And he doesn't call Judas out by name. Tim Keller, he says in that moment, he's not trying to shatter Judas, he's trying to melt his heart. One of you will betray me. I see you, I know it's you, Judas. Don't do this. That's agape love. He doesn't condemn Judas, he's trying to convict him. Right? Love doesn't excuse the behavior, but it doesn't blow the person up either. And then later that night, when Judas approaches with his kiss of betrayal, Jesus says to him, friend, do what you came here to do. He calls him friend. He invites him into his circle. He invites him to his table. He all throughout Judas's relationship with Jesus, Jesus loved him, right? Loved him. In love, Jesus was trying to woo his enemy, not crush him. And of course, the truth is, we were his enemies. If you're a Christian, Jesus, we were enemies of God. We aren't any better than Judas. All the other disciples betrayed Jesus too, abandoned Jesus too, denied Jesus too, and we're no different either. Romans 5, it says that while we were his enemies, Christ died for us. While we were his enemies, Christ died. In the greatest act of agape love, Jesus loved his enemies. He loved us, and his love changed us. Right? Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. And now we're no longer God's enemies, but we are his friend. Even more than that, we are his sons, his daughters, children of the Most High God. But listen, apart from putting your trust in Jesus and in his act of agape love on the cross, that's not true of you, right? Some of you watching, you're still enemies of God. You're still his enemy. But the good news is that Jesus isn't like our culture. He's not like you and me. Jesus loves his enemies, and so there's so much hope for you. But we have to realize the last thing too. For us to turn to Jesus, to receive his love, we've got to realize the last motivation, the last reason that Jesus gives for why we should do this, why we should have this heart, why we should seek to love our enemies. We have to realize the last thing too, and it's Jesus taking us back to what we talked about at the beginning. He says this in verse 37, judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but don't notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take out the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck that is in your brother's eye. What is he saying here? Jesus is saying, hey, you aren't all that unlike your enemy anyways. You're not that much different than him, are you? He's saying, hey, you're an enemy of others too. You do some things too. He's not saying here that we can never judge what is right or wrong, or that we can never condemn evil. That's not what he means, right? He's talking about a spirit of judgmentalism. He's talking about a heart that so quickly condemns. He's talking about that kind of bitterness that never forgives. He's talking about that hypocrisy, right? Like, it's a pretty funny picture that he paints here, where he's talking about the speck of wrong in somebody else's eye, but you've got this giant 2x4 stuck in our eye. And he's like, man, how can you even see clearly? How do you even know that your enemy is wrong? Maybe they're right and you're wrong. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, don't forget that you're needy, that you're a sinner too. that you're poor in spirit, that you're oppressed by sin. Don't forget how you came to me if you're a Christian, right? That you needed grace, that you needed mercy. And so show your enemy mercy in the same way that I have been merciful to you. He's saying, be humble. Hey, don't you want to be different? Hey, don't you want to be a son? Hey, don't you want to be humble? And he gives us these motivations. Agape love, this love that moves, this love that acts, this love that forgives, it's revolutionary. It's the kind of love that moves Brant John, the brother of the man who Amber Geiger killed in Dallas a couple of years ago. And this just powerful, dramatic moment, maybe you saw it, where he steps down from the bench at the trial and he says, I forgive you. And he hugs her. That's revolutionary love. It's the kind of love that Rachel Denhollander forgives the doctor, right? USA gymnastics doctor that had sexually abused her and over 265 other women. It's the kind of love that causes her to stand in court and say, I forgive you. What you did was wrong. It's not okay. I came forward, right? I came forward to bring justice, but I also have mercy for you. That's agape love. That is loving your enemies. It's a love that's not okay with wrong. It's a love that doesn't agree with anything unjust or evil, but it's a love that can bring about change and revolution. And it's the kind of love that changes you too. It's the kind of love that Jesus has for you that can bring change, revolution in your heart too. Let me pray for you. God, I pray for my friends watching. I thank you for them. I thank you for their willingness to engage in spiritual conversation, their willingness to hear of your truth and this hard truth to love our enemies. Thank you that you have loved us, that we were your enemy and you loved us. Thank you for your perfect love that drives out our fears. We thank you, Jesus. Amen. Love you guys.